A cold, harsh wind howled outside, rattling the windows of George's grand mansion as if it were trying to force its way into the warm haven within. Earlier that evening, a fierce storm had drenched the upscale neighborhood, leaving the streets coated in mud and debris. Inside the house, the luxurious interior was a stark contrast to the chaos outside. Soft lighting reflected off elegant furniture, creating an atmosphere of coziness and refinement. Yet, despite the serenity of the setting, the tension in the room was palpable. Kadia's voice sliced through the silence like a blade, filled with anger and disbelief. "Are you out of your mind, George? Letting that filthy girl into our home?" Her eyes burned with fury, her lips pressed into a tight line of disdain. To her, George's decision was an unforgivable betrayal. George, standing firm, responded with measured calm. "For God's sake, Kadia, she's just a kid. Look at the state she's in. It's freezing out there and she was covered in mud. How could I leave her like that?" His voice carried a note of pleading, an attempt to soften his wife's rigid stance. The source of their argument stood at the heart of George's impulsive yet compassionate decision. A young homeless girl, no older than 15, had been shivering on the street in the bitter cold. Moved by her plight, George had invited her inside to warm up, take a shower, and have something to eat. To him, it was a simple act of kindness. To Kadia, it was a disgraceful violation of their home's sanctity. "You're making us look ridiculous, George," Kadia snapped, her voice echoing off the polished walls. "What will people think if they find out? How could you undermine me like this?" George sighed, weariness creeping into his tone. "She's not staying, Kadia. She just needs a warm meal and a chance to clean up. She'll be gone soon." His patience was wearing thin, but he held his ground, unwilling to abandon his principles of compassion. Turning away from the heated exchange, George retreated to the kitchen. The unyielding bitterness in Kadia's words stung, but he chose to busy himself preparing something for the girl to eat. He called out, his tone resolute, "Are you going to help or are you just going to stand there complaining? What's done is done." His decision was final, and he knew there was no turning back. As he entered the dining area, he noticed the girl standing quietly near the doorway, clutching a blanket he had given her earlier. Her timid demeanor made his heart ache, but it was something on her arm that stopped him in his tracks, a small, faint birthmark that seemed all too familiar. George's breath caught as recognition dawned. His pulse quickened and his knees gave way as he fell to the floor, overwhelmed by the flood of emotions. The birthmark mirrored one he had seen before, a detail that connected the girl to a part of his life he thought he had lost forever. The room seemed to close in around him as realization struck. In that moment, the storm outside was nothing compared to the tempest now raging within George's heart. A wealthy man, George stood resolute in his decision to offer aid to Milena, a homeless teenage girl he had encountered earlier that evening. His wife, Kadia, fumed with indignation, her sharp words cutting through the warm, sophisticated ambience of their mansion. "How dare you bring someone like that into our home?" she snapped, her fury etched into every word. George remained calm, his voice steady. "She's just a child, Kadia. Look outside, the storm is brutal. She needed help," he reasoned, glancing toward the window where the howling wind rattled the glass. He emphasized his point with quiet determination. "She'll eat, clean up, and leave. That's all." Reluctantly, Kadia followed her husband to the kitchen, her steps hesitant, her mind racing with resentment. While her presence was there, her thoughts spiraled, questioning his judgment. She couldn't fathom how her husband's heart could override what she saw as their dignity. Milena, on the other hand, had barely survived the harsh streets that day. At only 15, her existence was one of constant struggle. Clothed in tattered garments, she had spent her mornings scavenging for food amidst the garbage bins of the city's back alleys. Hunger gnawed at her insides like a relentless torment, but it wasn't new, it was a daily affliction. The rain that morning had driven her to seek shelter under a small awning. Shivering, she stared into the distance, wishing for a warm meal, something to fill the emptiness inside. Her gaze caught sight of a luxurious car cruising through the puddle-filled streets, its pristine exterior shining even amidst the rain. The stark contrast between her bleak reality and the vehicle's opulence sparked an idea. Desperation gave her the courage to venture into the wealthiest neighborhood she knew. There must be food there, she thought, driven by hope and hunger. It was there that her path crossed with George's. Despite her timid demeanor and bedraggled appearance, George saw something in her, a spark of humanity he couldn't ignore. Back in the kitchen, Kadia's protests continued, though they softened under George's unwavering stance. As Milena quietly ate the food he had prepared, she couldn't help but feel out of place. But for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a glimmer of warmth, not just from the mansion's shelter but from a stranger's kindness. As George glanced at Milena's arm, something caught his attention, a small, familiar mark. His heart skipped a beat as recognition dawned. Overcome with emotion, he sank to his knees, unable to process the realization. The storm outside paled in comparison to the whirlwind of emotions raging within the walls of their home. Milena sat shivering under a makeshift shelter, her thoughts swirling with frustration. She had searched the city's garbage bins countless times, and while she occasionally found generous scraps, today was proving to be a bitter exception. As the rain eased, she adjusted her wet clothes and resolved to head toward the wealthiest neighborhood in the city. The elegant mansions there, with their lush gardens and towering walls, held the promise of discarded food far better than anything she had found elsewhere. Her legs ached from walking, her thin shoes doing little to shield her from the cold pavement, but her hunger spurred her forward. The stark contrast between her reality and the grandeur of the neighborhood didn't faze her. She was singularly focused on finding something to eat. Her stomach growled and she pressed on, ignoring the chill that numbed her fingers and toes. Once there, Milena approached the pristine trash bins with a mix of hope and apprehension. In the past, this affluent area had yielded treasures: untouched bread, fresh fruit, even pastries on rare occasions. But today was different. Despite her thorough search, she came up empty-handed. Disappointment settled in as the temperature dropped, the wind biting at her skin like icy needles. As the day turned to evening, Milena's determination kept her moving from bin to bin. Her fragile body shivered uncontrollably, the cold seeping into her bones. Suddenly, her weakened legs gave out beneath her, and she slipped into a muddy puddle. The freezing water splashed over her face and soaked her tattered clothes. "This is just my luck," she muttered through gritted teeth, her voice trembling with frustration and despair. Embarrassed, she tried to brush the mud from her clothes, but it only smeared further, leaving her even more vulnerable to the biting wind. The dampness intensified her misery, and every gust felt like a blade cutting into her skin. Her strength was waning and her empty stomach left her feeling faint. She knew she couldn't stay there much longer. Returning to the alley she called home, with its makeshift bedding of cardboard and an old blanket, felt just as impossible. Exhaustion overtook her, and she feared that if she lingered in the cold much longer, she might collapse completely. Desperation replaced hesitation. She needed help, no matter how humiliating it felt. But who would help someone like me? She thought bitterly, her feet dragging as she stumbled along the sidewalk. Silent tears streamed down her face, freezing in the icy air. Her skin stung, her hope dimmed, and fear crept into her thoughts. Then, through her blurred vision, she noticed a mansion. Its warm, golden lights spilled into the night, and the sight brought a fleeting sense of comfort. From inside, she imagined the inviting warmth and safety she craved. For a moment, her fear dissipated, replaced by a fragile determination. With trembling hands, she approached the grand house. The towering gate loomed before her as she reached out, barely able to steady her fingers. Gathering the last of her courage, Milena pressed the doorbell, her heart pounding in her chest. Seconds later, the door creaked open, revealing an elegant woman who appeared to be in her 50s. Her flawless appearance and air of sophistication spoke of wealth and privilege. For a fleeting moment, Milena thought she looked familiar, but any such thought was quickly overshadowed by the icy, judgmental gaze that bore down on her, making her feel even smaller than she already did. The woman's expression, initially neutral, twisted into one of clear disdain as her eyes scanned the filthy, rain-soaked girl standing at her doorstep. "What do you want, you filthy thing? Why are you bothering me at this hour?" the woman snapped, her tone sharp and cutting as though Milena's mere presence was an insult. Milena shrank under the harsh words, her cheeks flushing with shame. Her voice trembled as she stammered, barely above a whisper, I'm so cold. Could I please clean up? Even if it's just outside near the tank. I just want to get the mud off." The woman didn't even consider her plea. Instead, her expression hardened further and her voice rose, dripping with contempt. "Get out of here, you filthy beggar," she yelled, her disdain slicing through the cold night air. Milena's shoulders slumped as the humiliation washed over her. She wasn't surprised by the rejection. Words like these were hurled at her almost daily, but the sting of such cruel treatment never dulled. Fighting back tears, she turned away silently, her steps slow and unsteady as the cold bit at her trembling frame. Her eyes, filled with sorrow, reflected the pain of yet another door shut in her face. But before she could leave, a firm male voice interrupted, calling from behind the woman. What's going on here, Katia? A tall, imposing man emerged, his presence commanding attention. It was George, the owner of the mansion. Katia spun around, her face curling into an expression of mockery and irritation. She wasted no time in explaining, her voice laced with sarcasm. This girl, she scoffed, had the audacity to ask if she could wash up here. Can you believe it? Completely ridiculous. Her tone dripped with smug superiority, as if she expected George to share her amusement. But instead of the agreement she anticipated, he turned to her with a stern, disappointed look. Don't you have any compassion, woman? He said firmly, his voice steady and full of reproach. Katia's self-satisfied smirk vanished instantly, replaced by a stunned silence. George then shifted his attention to Milena, his expression softening into one of genuine kindness. Come on, sweetheart, he said gently. You can take a warm bath and I'll make sure you get something to eat. It's far too cold for you to be out here like this. Milena hesitated, stunned by the unexpected kindness. Her knees nearly buckled under the weight of relief as she nodded timidly, accepting his offer. George guided her inside, his warm demeanor a stark contrast to Katia's cold hostility. Katia stood frozen, her face twisting with unrestrained fury as she watched her husband escort the girl through their home. The sight of George fetching clothes for Milena and showing her to the bathroom ignited a fire of indignation within her. Being overruled and ignored in her own home felt like a personal affront. In the bathroom, Milena stood in the warmth of the enclosed space, her body trembling as hot water cascaded over her. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt clean and safe. Outside, Katia fumed in silence, unaware that her world was about to change in ways she couldn't yet imagine. Milena stepped into the bathroom, where the warm air enveloped her like a comforting embrace. As the hot water cascaded over her skin, years of grime and sorrow seemed to dissolve. Each droplet felt like it was melting away the frozen layers of hardship that life had mercilessly piled onto her young shoulders. It was a sensation so foreign yet so soothing. Milena couldn't remember the last time she'd had a proper bath, let alone the luxury of warm water. The steam filled the small room, creating a cocoon of safety. For a brief, blissful moment, she forgot the bleak alleyway she would soon return to. She lingered under the stream until her muscles relaxed completely, her mind momentarily free from the burdens she carried. After finishing, she dried off and slipped into the clothes George had given her. Clean and warm, she almost didn't recognize herself in the mirror. It felt surreal, as though she had been given a fleeting glimpse of a different life. Though her heart was lighter, she knew this reprieve was temporary. The cold, damp streets awaited her return. Milena gathered her courage and prepared to leave, but gratitude compelled her to say something before departing. She turned to George, her voice soft and sincere. Thank you so much for your kindness. I'll never forget this. But before she could step away, George's calm and gentle voice stopped her. Wait, child. Don't go just yet. Sit down and have something to eat. It's far too cold out there to leave on an empty stomach. Milena hesitated, stunned by his unexpected offer. She glanced at the man, searching for answers in his kind eyes. Why would someone like him, a stranger, show such compassion? What she didn't know was that George's heart bore the weight of his own sorrow. Years ago he had lost his young daughter, Ramana, when she was only 5. The loss had left a void he could never fill, and now, seeing Milena, he couldn't help but feel an unexplainable connection. In her, he saw the echoes of what might have been, perhaps even the same age his daughter would have been had she survived. Milena's rumbling stomach betrayed her hesitation, and she shyly accepted the offer. The smell of hot soup filled the air, and when George placed a steaming bowl before her, her eyes lit up as though she'd been handed a priceless treasure. Thank you so much, she murmured, her voice trembling with emotion. For the first time in what felt like forever, she would taste something warm and nourishing. As Milena lifted the spoon to her lips, Katia watched from across the room, her face tightening in fury. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and her eyebrows knitted together in a storm of barely concealed disgust. The sight of the young girl sitting at her table was, to Katia, an insult she couldn't tolerate. But just as she opened her mouth to unleash another cutting remark, something caught her attention, a detail that froze her in place. Katia's eyes widened in shock, her breath hitching. Her hands trembled ever so slightly as she stared at Milena. This can't be, she whispered, her voice barely audible. A chill coursed through her as beads of sweat formed on her brow. Unable to tear her gaze away, she was overcome by a wave of disbelief and panic, her thoughts racing in every direction. Meanwhile, Milena remained blissfully unaware of the turmoil unfolding around her. She focused on the bowl of soup, savoring the warmth it brought to her tired body, unaware that fate had meticulously orchestrated this moment to unravel secrets yet untold. As Milena reached out to take the bowl of soup, the sleeve of her shirt slipped slightly, exposing a mark on her forearm. George's eyes caught sight of it, freezing him in place, the same way it had stunned Katia moments before. His heart raced like it hadn't in years. "That mark?" he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Noticing his intense gaze, Milena hesitated, her voice trembling as she asked, "Is something wrong, sir?" George didn't respond right away. His eyes remained fixed on the mark, then roved over her face, scrutinizing every feature and comparing them to memories he had cherished for years. Suddenly he dropped to his knees, tears streaming down his face. "It's her. It's her," he exclaimed, his voice breaking. He turned to Katia, who stood rooted to the spot, stunned. "It's her, Katia. My daughter, she's come back to me?" Milena, still clutching the untouched bowl, felt her world tilt as confusion swept over her. "What daughter?" she thought, overwhelmed and unable to comprehend the man's words. George, trembling but resolute, gently grasped Milena's arm to reveal a matching mark on his own. His voice quivered as he said, "You're Ramana, aren't you? You're my daughter." The room erupted into emotional chaos. Milena sat frozen, her mind spinning, while Katia trembled, torn between fear and fury. Her expression contorted with disdain, and she spat venomously, "No, George. She's not her. She's a filthy street rat." But George ignored Katia's words, his gaze locked on Milena, who bore an uncanny resemblance to the little girl he had lost and the woman he had once loved. The mark on her arm was proof he couldn't dismiss. She looked exactly as Ramana would have at her age, carrying traces of his late wife's features. Katia, however, couldn't accept this turn of events. Her hatred boiled over, and her voice cracked as she screamed, "It's impossible. She can't be your daughter because I got rid of her." George's eyes widened in shock as the weight of her words sank in. "What did you just say?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Realizing the enormity of her outburst, Katia stammered, scrambling for an excuse, but George wouldn't let it slide. "What do you mean you got rid of her?" he shouted, fury and anguish intertwining. The truth began to unravel. Years earlier, after the death of George's first wife, the mother of Ramana, he had remarried, believing Katia would be a caring stepmother. But Katia saw the child as a threat, a living reminder of George's first love and the sole heir to his fortune. For 2 years, she had harbored silent resentment until her bitterness drove her to commit the unthinkable. Katia's face flushed with anger and desperation as George's piercing gaze demanded answers. The revelation tore through him, his grief and betrayal flooding back with unrelenting force. Milena, caught in the storm of emotions and revelations, sat in stunned silence, the weight of an identity she didn't even know she possessed pressing heavily on her chest. Hatred had taken deep root in Katia's heart, and one day, consumed by rage and bitterness, she set her cruel plan into motion while George was away on a business trip. She fabricated a story about burglars breaking into the house and kidnapping the little girl, claiming the child had met a tragic end. George was devastated, believing he had lost his beloved daughter forever. But what he didn't know was that Katia had taken the 5-year-old to a distant river and heartlessly thrown her into the water. The girl hit her head as she fell, losing parts of her memory. Against all odds, however, the child survived. Disoriented and confused, she wandered until she reached an alley where she was taken in by a group of homeless people. When asked her name, the only thing she could recall was Milena, the name of her late mother. Milena grew up on the streets, completely unaware of the loving father who had been mourning her loss and tirelessly searching for her. Fate, which had cruelly torn them apart, had now brought them back together in a miraculous reunion. Overcome with sorrow and rage, George vowed to bring Katia to justice. Terrified, Katia confessed to everything she had done years ago. Without hesitation, George handed her over to the police. Despite his heartbreak at having lived a decade with a woman who had not only deceived him but also tried to take his daughter from him, George found solace in the fact that Ramana, who had lived as Milena, was finally back in his life. Milena could hardly believe that she would never have to return to the alley, never face hunger or the merciless cold of the streets again. For the first time, she had a home and a father who loved her unconditionally. In the months that followed, George made sure Milena, now Ramana, received therapy to help her heal. Slowly, fragments of her lost memories began to resurface. She started to recall pieces of her past, her identity, and the life she once had. The road to fully reconnect with her memories was long, but both father and daughter were determined to walk it together. Now reunited, George and Ramana knew that nothing would ever separate them again. They had found each other against all odds and were ready to face the future as a family, forever bound by love and resilience. If this story moved you, be sure to check out the next video on your screen for another touching tale. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of our upcoming stories. A big hug and see you next time for another emotional journey.